I'm not a man who gets rattled easily. I run a business, pay my taxes, love my wife, and raised 3 kids I'd give my life for. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of loyalty, love, and sacrifice. But that day cracked my soul wide open. It wasn't the sterile smell of the hospital. It wasn't the doctor's pitiful look as he muttered, "I'm so sorry." It wasn't even the devastating words he finally choked out. No. It was the quiet ride home after. The slow, brutal realization that my entire life had been a lie. But let me take you back. Back to before the ground gave way beneath my feet. Because trust me, you're going to want to hear how this all ends. I'm Mark. I'm 56, been married to Lisa for over 3 decades, and we have, or had, 3 kids, Adam, Jessica, and Emily. 3 wonderful kids who I thought carried my blood, my legacy. Adam, our oldest, was hospitalized a few years ago with kidney issues. The doctor said it was serious, the kind of serious that could end with a transplant. When your kid's life hangs in the balance, you don't think twice. You just act. So I went to the hospital lab without telling Lisa. I figured if my kidney could save my son, I'd give it without hesitation. The results came back the next day. I wasn't a match. Not just incompatible, I wasn't his biological father. I remember the doctor shifting uncomfortably in his chair, stammering apologies like they could glue my world back together. I stumbled out of that office, numb. The hallway felt too long, the air too thin. There must be a mistake. That's what I kept telling myself. I didn't say anything to Lisa. Not at first. What if it was an error? Labs mess up all the time, right? But once that seed of doubt is planted, it doesn't stop growing. It digs its roots deep, wrapping around your heart, choking every rational thought. Every time I looked at Adam, I wondered. Every time I hugged Jessica or kissed Emily goodnight, I felt it, the crushing weight of uncertainty. Were they mine? Were any of them mine? It took me 2 days to work up the courage to ask Lisa, Jessica, and Emily to take DNA tests. I spun some story about creating a family medical profile in case any of us faced health problems like Adam's. Jessica didn't hesitate. Emily was cheerful about it. But Lisa. She froze. Just for a moment. But I caught it. Still, she agreed. The next day, I handed those samples over to the lab myself. No middleman. No mistakes. And then I waited. When the results came in, I parked my truck in the hospital lot, tore open the envelope, and felt my stomach drop. Adam wasn't mine. Jessica wasn't mine. But Emily. Emily was. 1 out of 3. I sat there gripping that paper so tightly it crumpled in my fists. My chest felt hollow, my head light. How do you go home after that? How do you walk into your house, look your wife in the eyes, and pretend like you're not suffocating? But I did. I walked through that front door. I kissed Lisa on the cheek. I asked Emily about her day. I listened to Jessica talk about work. I kept my head down and my mouth shut. 4 days, I carried that weight around. Lisa noticed, of course. She kept asking me if something was wrong, but every time she did, I'd just shake my head. Then, one evening, I came home from work, and Lisa was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. DNA results. Her eyes were red, her cheeks blotchy. She had been crying. Jessica isn't yours, she said in a broken whisper, but Emily is. The air left my lungs. I felt like I was underwater, every sound muffled and distant. I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. But then she said his name. David. A name that used to mean friend. A man who had been part of our lives for years, a man I'd shared beers with, laughed with, trusted. She said it started in the first year of our marriage. Not a mistake. Not a one-time thing. It went on for years. Long enough for her to have 2 children with him. And David. He'd been dead for 25 years. Dead. Gone. But still haunting me through the faces of the children I raised. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't even move. I just stood there. Lisa kept talking, kept trying to explain herself through tears and gasping breaths. She said she was young, confused, lonely. She said she loved me. But all I could hear was David. Over and over in my head. She begged me to let it go. She said it was ancient history. She asked if we could move on. Move on. After 30 years of lies. I walked past her, past the table covered in papers and DNA results, and went to our bedroom. I shut the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall. My world had been flipped upside down, and I had no idea how to set it right again. That night, as Lisa cried herself to sleep downstairs, I made a decision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I might not have been ready to confront it yet, but one thing was certain, I was going to get the truth. All of it. Because Lisa might think she could cry her way out of this, she might think she could sweep 30 years of betrayal under the rug. But she was dead wrong. And when I was done, when every secret was dragged into the light, Lisa wouldn't see it coming. She told me everything, or at least everything she thought I needed to hear. How it started in the early days of our marriage, how David whispered sweet nothings to her when I was out on late-night tow truck runs, how she felt like a child chasing crumbs of affection. It wasn't just physical, she said, it was love. But love doesn't make you destroy your husband's trust. Love doesn't make you sit at the same dinner table with him every night while carrying another man's child in your belly. Then she said something that made my stomach turn. She told me how David stopped seeing her after Adam was born, how he laughed in her face when she asked if he'd marry her. He told her she was on her own, that she could raise his son with me. But that wasn't the worst of it. She went on to describe an encounter, one that wasn't romantic, one that wasn't consensual. She said David came by one night when I was away. He forced himself on her, said if she didn't comply, he'd tell me the truth about Adam. She said it wasn't love that night. It was something dark and violent. And then he left her there, crying and broken, laughing as he said he hoped he'd left another baby in her. That baby turned out to be Jessica. Do you know what it feels like to sit across from your wife, the woman you've built an entire life with, and hear that? To hear her voice trembling with guilt, fear, and shame. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach across the table, hold her hand, and tell her everything would be okay. But I couldn't. There were too many cracks in the story, too many convenient details. She said David was gone now, taken in a car accident shortly after Jessica was born. She said she felt relief when he died, relief because she could finally put everything behind her and focus on our family. She told me she'd spent our entire marriage trying to make it up to me. Every dinner she cooked, every loving gesture, every moment we shared was her way of making amends. But those words felt hollow. 30 years of lies can't be patched up with apologies and tears. I told her I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend anymore. I told her I was going to see our lawyer and start divorce proceedings. She begged me not to. She clutched at my arm, tears streaming down her face, asking what we'd tell the kids, how we'd explain it. But that was the thing, Adam and Jessica didn't know. They didn't know I wasn't their biological father. They didn't know the man they called Dad had been living in ignorance their entire lives. I told her she had 1 week. 1 week to tell me her full story, 1 week to explain herself in a way that made sense. After that, I'd tell the kids the truth myself. Her face went pale. She begged me not to tell them, said it would break their hearts. But I wasn't backing down. Adam and Jessica might not carry my blood, but they were my children. I'd raised them. I'd taught Adam how to ride a bike and cheered at Jessica's high school graduation. None of that would ever change. But Lisa. I couldn't even look at her anymore. I told her I'd be moving into the guest bedroom. There was no way I could sleep beside her after everything I'd just heard. The next few days passed in a haze. I went to work, came home, ate dinner in silence, and avoided her as much as possible. Then came the phone call. It was early morning when the store called me. They said Lisa's car had gone over a guardrail, tumbling down an embankment. They said it looked like she had been speeding, like she hadn't even tried to make the turn. She was pronounced dead at the scene. I don't remember hanging up the phone. I don't remember driving to the hospital to identify her body. I don't remember much of anything from the day except the hollow feeling in my chest and the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The sheriff asked if Lisa had been having any problems lately, depression, stress, anything that might explain her driving like that. I told him no. I told him she'd seemed fine. I lied. I didn't tell him about the affair, about the DNA tests, about the argument in our kitchen just days before. I couldn't. They ruled her death an accident. No alcohol in her system, no drugs, nothing suspicious. Just an accident. At the funeral, I stood by her casket, looking down at the woman I'd loved for 3 decades. The woman who had given me children, shared my bed, and shattered my heart. I grieved for her. Despite everything, I grieved. Because love and hate aren't as far apart as people think. They live side by side, tangled together so tightly that sometimes you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. After the funeral, I asked my daughters and my daughter-in-law to pack up Lisa's things. I didn't want anything except a few family photos, pictures of us smiling, of the kids growing up, of holidays where everything felt simple and whole. The house felt empty after they left. Too quiet. Too still. And that's when the what-if started creeping in. What if I'd never taken the DNA test? What if I'd never confronted her? What if I'd just kept my head down and pretended everything was fine? Would she still be here? Would we still be eating dinner together, laughing at some sitcom on TV? Or was this inevitable? Was she always speeding toward that guardrail, with or without me knowing the truth? It's been 2 years since Lisa's death, and those questions still haunt me. The answers, I've realized, don't matter anymore. But one thing's for sure, this story isn't over. Not for me. Not for my kids. And not for the ghost of a marriage that still lingers in every corner of this house. Because the truth? The truth doesn't set you free. It just leaves you with more questions. And trust me, there's more to this story than meets the eye. You ever meet someone and immediately know their story is filled with struggles they didn't deserve? That was Maria. After Lisa's death, the holidays had become something I dreaded. Empty rooms, hollow laughter from the TV, and memories hanging heavy in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was drifting, stuck between grief and bitterness. That's when I got the idea. If I couldn't fix my own family, maybe I could bring some light into someone else's. At church, they had one of those Christmas trees with little paper ornaments hanging from the branches. Each one had a name, a family in need. I asked Pastor Jim for a name, a family that really needed help, not just one that hit a rough patch recently. He gave me a slip of paper, Maria Evans. Widow. 3 kids. The name stuck with me. I'd seen her before. Maria worked at Joe's Diner, a greasy spoon I'd been going to for years. Joe and I had known each other since high school, and there wasn't much in town he didn't know. I walked into the diner one slow afternoon, the lull between breakfast and lunch rush. Joe gave me a nod from behind the counter as I sat down at a corner table. Maria was moving between tables with practiced efficiency. Shoulder-length dark hair, tired eyes that still held warmth, and a smile that lit up her face when it was genuine. When she came over to take my order, I could tell she was cautious. I wasn't a stranger, she'd seen me there before, but I was still just another customer. I asked for coffee and, awkwardly, told her I'd picked her name from the church tree. She froze, calculating, trying to figure out if I had some kind of angle. Joe must have noticed because he called over, telling her I was good people. She relaxed a little, but there was still a guardedness in her voice. I told her straight up, I wasn't there to flirt, or out of pity, or to make her feel like a charity case. I just wanted to help, really help, through Thanksgiving and Christmas. Her smile cracked a little then, and her eyes glossed over with unshed tears. She asked me why. Didn't I have family to spend the holidays with? I told her about Lisa. About the accident. About the silence of my empty house. Her face softened. She didn't pity me, she understood me. We agreed to meet again, this time at her place. That Saturday, I showed up with 2 pizzas in hand because, as Maria warned me, her 8-year-old son could eat half of one by himself. When I pulled into the complex where she lived, I felt a lump in my throat. It was one of those government-assisted housing projects. Broken playgrounds, laundry hanging from windows, and kids growing up faster than they should. A little boy with bright eyes met me at the door. He introduced himself as Mike and proudly announced his mom said her friend Mark was bringing pizza. Before I could step inside, 2 more kids appeared, Luke, 6, all energy and crooked smiles, and Sophie, 4 but sharp as a tack. She announced her name like royalty, and I couldn't help but laugh. The apartment was small but clean. The TV flickered with cartoons, the furniture was mismatched, and the air smelled faintly of something sweet, maybe a candle trying to mask the mustiness of old carpet. We sat at the kitchen table. The kids devoured their pizza while Maria poured me a cup of coffee. Looking around, it hit me just how much this woman was holding together on her own. 3 kids, a job with long hours and low pay, and a home that was little more than 4 walls and a lock on the door. She told me they got by. They had enough to eat, second-hand clothes, and cheap cable for the kids to have something to watch. But things like bikes or new toys, those were out of reach. When Mike asked if we could go see the new Harry Potter movie that weekend, I said yes without thinking twice. Maria hesitated, but the kids' excitement was impossible to ignore. We made plans. A movie. McDonald's afterward. Happy Meals for Sophie and double cheeseburgers for the boys. That night, as I drove home, I realized something. I felt good. For the first time in a long while, the silence of my house wasn't suffocating. Over the next few weekends, I spent more time with Maria and the kids. Movies, park trips, ice cream runs. Small moments that felt bigger than they were. At the diner, I always sat in Maria's section. I left bigger tips than usual, not because I felt like I owed her, but because I wanted to. One afternoon, she told me I didn't have to keep leaving money. She said she felt like she owed me something in return, and she didn't like that feeling. I told her she didn't owe me anything, not a dinner, not gratitude, nothing. Her kids' smiles, the way they lit up over a simple Happy Meal or a movie, was more than enough. But Maria was stubborn. She insisted on making Thanksgiving dinner for me. I agreed, but I could tell it embarrassed her a little to ask. When Emily came home from college for the weekend, she asked me about Maria. She wanted to know if I was sure about all this, helping a family I barely knew. I told her the truth. Helping Maria and her kids gave me purpose. Their smiles made the holidays feel warm again. She didn't say much after that, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. Maria's world was fragile, held together by her sheer willpower and her love for her kids. And I felt like I was walking a tightrope. One wrong step, one misplaced word, and it could all fall apart. But I wasn't going to let that happen. The holidays were coming fast, and I had made a promise to Maria, to those kids, and maybe even to myself. For once, I wasn't going to let anyone down. But little did I know, promises like that are easier made than kept. But even simple things have a way of getting complicated. Emily had come home for the weekend, and like the sharp observer she'd always been, she noticed. It wasn't anything dramatic, no grand confessions or obvious gestures. It was in the way I talked about Maria, the way I smiled when I mentioned the kids. Emily could read me like an open book, and I could tell she was piecing it all together. When I told her about Maria and why I was helping, Emily listened quietly. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just sat there with her arms crossed, her serious look fixed on me. Then she said she wanted to meet Maria herself. That Saturday, I invited Maria and her kids over for a cookout. It was chilly out, but grilling has a way of breaking down walls and getting people to relax. Maria pulled up in her worn-down car, the kids tumbling out with excitement. Mike, the oldest, was wide-eyed as he looked around the yard. Luke was full of questions about the hot tub. And Sophie. She walked straight up to me, held out her little arms, and expected to be picked up, which I did without hesitation. Emily watched everything carefully. She greeted Maria with a warm but measured smile, and the two disappeared into the kitchen while I kept the boys busy. Sophie stayed with the women. Maria told her they needed her expert cooking advice, and Sophie took the role very seriously. While Emily and Maria cooked, the boys and I went to the store to grab some movies. They picked action flicks, but I grabbed The Little Mermaid for Sophie. When we got back, her little hands clapped in excitement. It was her favorite movie. The day went smoother than I'd expected. The kids were loud but happy, the food was great, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt alive. When the kids were finally full and parked in front of the TV, Emily and I had a quiet moment in the living room. She looked at me with those knowing eyes of hers and said, "Dad, Maria's a good person. She's been through hell, but she's holding it together for her kids. And I think she cares about you, a lot." I brushed it off at first. Of course, she cared. I was helping her family. Gratitude can look like affection sometimes. But Emily shook her head. She said women could sense these things. Then she said something else that stuck with me. She told me I looked happy. Genuinely, deeply happy. And it was true. The following weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm. Emily and Maria planned Thanksgiving dinner together. Watching them work side by side felt oddly natural, Emily's sharp wit balancing Maria's quiet strength. I kept visiting Joe's diner, always sitting in Maria's section and leaving tips that were probably too big. Twice a week, I stopped by her apartment with little treats for the kids, ice cream, coloring books, small toys. Maria would lightly scold me, saying I was spoiling them, but her smile gave her away. Thanksgiving arrived faster than I expected. Maria showed up early with the kids in tow. She wasn't dressed up, just a simple skirt and blouse, but she looked beautiful in a way I couldn't quite put into words. Emily had invited her boyfriend, a paramedic she'd met in nursing school. Adam and his wife, Gail, arrived shortly after with their 2 kids, followed by Jessica and her husband, Rob. The house was full. Full of voices, laughter, and footsteps thundering up and down the stairs. It felt right. The kids bonded instantly. Mike and Luke joined my grandkids in a whirlwind of energy, while little Sophie planted herself between Emily and Maria in the kitchen, offering very serious culinary advice. The men, myself included, hovered at the edges of the kitchen, shooed away whenever we got too close to the food. At one point, Adam pulled me aside. He had that serious older brother look he gets when he's about to say something important. He asked me about Maria. Her story, her age, if I was sure about all this. Rob chimed in, saying it was unusual, me, a widower in my 50s, spending so much time with a woman in her early 30s. I told them the truth. Maria was a widow. Her husband had been murdered, and she'd been left to raise 3 kids on her own. She wasn't asking for help, wasn't playing the victim. She was surviving. Adam nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. Rob smirked and said, "Aren't you afraid she might fall for you, Dad? Or worse, that you might fall for her?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Thanksgiving dinner was perfect. The food was incredible, the kids behaved, mostly, and everyone left the table full and happy. But as I sat there, surrounded by family, with Maria laughing softly at something Emily said and the kids playing in the background, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. It wasn't about Maria being young or beautiful or grateful. It was about this. The life in the room. The warmth. The noise. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, I sat by the window with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the snow beginning to fall. The thing about hope is, it's fragile. It's easy to crush, easy to lose. I had to be careful. For Maria, for her kids, for my family. Because if I let myself hope too much, if I let myself believe this could turn into something real, well, I wasn't sure if I could handle losing that again. But deep down, I knew it was already happening. And that scared me more than anything. But even simple things have a way of getting complicated. Emily had come home for the weekend, and like the sharp observer she'd always been, she noticed. It wasn't anything dramatic, no grand confessions or obvious gestures. It was in the way I talked about Maria, the way I smiled when I mentioned the kids. Emily could read me like an open book, and I could tell she was piecing it all together. When I told her about Maria and why I was helping, Emily listened quietly. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge, just sat there with her arms crossed, her serious look fixed on me. Then she said she wanted to meet Maria herself. That Saturday, I invited Maria and her kids over for a cookout. It was chilly out, but grilling has a way of breaking down walls and getting people to relax. Maria pulled up in her worn-down car, the kids tumbling out with excitement. Mike, the oldest, was wide-eyed as he looked around the yard. Luke was full of questions about the hot tub. And Sophie. She walked straight up to me, held out her little arms, and expected to be picked up, which I did without hesitation. Emily watched everything carefully. She greeted Maria with a warm but measured smile, and the two disappeared into the kitchen while I kept the boys busy. Sophie stayed with the women. Maria told her they needed her expert cooking advice, and Sophie took the role very seriously. While Emily and Maria cooked, the boys and I went to the store to grab some movies. They picked action flicks, but I grabbed The Little Mermaid for Sophie. When we got back, her little hands clapped in excitement. It was her favorite movie. The day went smoother than I'd expected. The kids were loud but happy, the food was great, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt alive. When the kids were finally full and parked in front of the TV, Emily and I had a quiet moment in the living room. She looked at me with those knowing eyes of hers and said, "Dad, Maria's a good person. She's been through hell, but she's holding it together for her kids. And I think she cares about you, a lot." I brushed it off at first. Of course, she cared. I was helping her family. Gratitude can look like affection sometimes. But Emily shook her head. She said women could sense these things. Then she said something else that stuck with me. She told me I looked happy. Genuinely, deeply happy. And it was true. The following weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm. Emily and Maria planned Thanksgiving dinner together. Watching them work side by side felt oddly natural, Emily's sharp wit balancing Maria's quiet strength. I kept visiting Joe's diner, always sitting in Maria's section and leaving tips that were probably too big. Twice a week, I stopped by her apartment with little treats for the kids, ice cream, coloring books, small toys. Maria would lightly scold me, saying I was spoiling them, but her smile gave her away. Thanksgiving arrived faster than I expected. Maria showed up early with the kids in tow. She wasn't dressed up, just a simple skirt and blouse, but she looked beautiful in a way I couldn't quite put into words. Emily had invited her boyfriend, a paramedic she'd met in nursing school. Adam and his wife, Gail, arrived shortly after with their 2 kids, followed by Jessica and her husband, Rob. The house was full. Full of voices, laughter, and footsteps thundering up and down the stairs. It felt right. The kids bonded instantly. Mike and Luke joined my grandkids in a whirlwind of energy, while little Sophie planted herself between Emily and Maria in the kitchen, offering very serious culinary advice. The men, myself included, hovered at the edges of the kitchen, shooed away whenever we got too close to the food. At one point, Adam pulled me aside. He had that serious older brother look he gets when he's about to say something important. He asked me about Maria. Her story, her age, if I was sure about all this. Rob chimed in, saying it was unusual, me, a widower in my 50s, spending so much time with a woman in her early 30s. I told them the truth. Maria was a widow. Her husband had been murdered, and she'd been left to raise 3 kids on her own. She wasn't asking for help, wasn't playing the victim. She was surviving. Adam nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. Rob smirked and said, "Aren't you afraid she might fall for you, Dad? Or worse, that you might fall for her?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Thanksgiving dinner was perfect. The food was incredible, the kids behaved, mostly, and everyone left the table full and happy. But as I sat there, surrounded by family, with Maria laughing softly at something Emily said and the kids playing in the background, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. It wasn't about Maria being young or beautiful or grateful. It was about this. The life in the room. The warmth. The noise. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, I sat by the window with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the snow beginning to fall. The thing about hope is, it's fragile. It's easy to crush, easy to lose. I had to be careful. For Maria, for her kids, for my family. Because if I let myself hope too much, if I let myself believe this could turn into something real, well, I wasn't sure if I could handle losing that again. But deep down, I knew it was already happening. And that scared me more than anything. But with every passing moment, the lines got blurrier. After Maria and the kids moved in, the house felt alive again. Laughter, chaos, the clatter of little feet, it reminded me of when my kids were small, when Lisa and I would collapse onto the couch after bedtime, exhausted but content. One night, while I was buried in paperwork in my office, Sophie appeared in the doorway. Her little princess nightgown brushed the floor, and her damp hair clung to her rosy cheeks. "Can I say good night?" she asked, already climbing onto my lap before I could nod. She wrapped her tiny arms around my neck, kissed my cheek, and whispered, "Good night, Mr. Mark." Moments like that hit you hard. They remind you why you're doing all this in the first place. Later that night, I heard Maria moving around in the hallway after her shower. She walked past my office, her robe cinched tightly around her, hair still damp. She paused briefly, whispered good night, and disappeared into her room. The next morning was pure chaos: breakfast spills, school drop-offs, daycare calls. Maria managed it all with grace. She asked me to call Joe at the diner to let him know she might be late. When I called Joe, he didn't beat around the bush. He asked if I was serious about Maria, if I was just being kind or if there was something more. I told him the truth: I cared about Maria and the kids. I didn't know where this was going, but I wasn't going to let them down. That evening, we went back to Maria's old apartment to pack whatever was salvageable. Mike and Luke rode with me in the truck while Maria and Sophie followed in her clunky old car. Walking through that broken space, cold, half empty, it was clear this place had never been a home. Maria quietly gathered a few keepsakes: a photo of her late husband, stuffed animals, kitchen utensils. When she turned in her keys, I saw something shift in her posture: relief, maybe even a hint of peace. Back at the house, Emily called. Maria answered, and I could hear Emily's voice through the receiver, sharp, worried. Emily asked why Maria and the kids were staying here, why they weren't in a motel or somewhere else. When Maria handed me the phone, Emily didn't hold back. She said she was worried about me, about the situation, about how all this looked from the outside. I told her I wasn't just going to throw money at Maria and send her on her way. I told her they mattered to me. Emily sighed, said she understood, but reminded me that this was fragile, that hearts, especially little ones, were at stake. After the call, Maria and I sat together in the living room. The boys were playing upstairs, and Sophie was drawing quietly at the kitchen table. Maria looked tired, emotionally and physically drained. She told me Emily was right. This situation was messy. It wasn't fair to anyone if it all fell apart. But then she said something else. She said she cared about me, not just as someone helping her family, but as a man. I wanted to say I felt the same, that she'd brought something back into my life I thought was lost forever. But the weight of guilt, over Lisa, over the past, kept me silent. That evening, the kids asked if they could use the hot tub. I said only if their mom joined them. Partly because I didn't want them unsupervised, but mostly because I wanted Maria to relax. The boys practically dragged her upstairs to get her swimsuit. When she finally stepped out in a modest two-piece, she rolled her eyes at me. But she was smiling. The kids laughed and splashed around in the hot tub while Maria leaned back, her face peaceful in the rising steam. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt perfect. The next morning, Maria's car refused to start again. I was losing patience with that rusted piece of junk. I grabbed my tow truck and headed to the diner to pick her up. When I arrived, two men were leaning casually against her car, talking to her in that overly familiar way that set my teeth on edge. I walked over, thanked them for their help, and told them I'd take it from there. Then, without thinking, I referred to Maria as my fiancée. The men backed off immediately. On the drive home, Maria was quiet. Eventually, she asked why I'd called her that, why I'd said something so permanent. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one, but because I wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. Instead, I drove us to a junkyard. I told her to grab whatever personal items she wanted from the car. It was time to let it go. At first, she was stunned. But then she nodded and started loading a garbage bag with old trinkets, toys, and photos. When we were done, she turned to me and asked, "What am I supposed to drive now?" I told her we'd figure it out. Because one thing was clear, I wasn't letting her go back to that broken-down car, and I wasn't letting her feel like she was alone. Not now. not ever. But even as I said it, I knew we were walking a fine line. And sooner or later, we'd have to face what was coming. There are moments in life where the air feels heavy, thick with emotions too painful to bear. Sitting in my living room with all three of my kids staring at me, doubt, confusion, and hurt on their faces, was one of those moments. It started when Adam, Jessica, and Emily showed up at my store unannounced. They weren't outwardly angry, but there was tension in the way they spoke, the way their eyes darted, searching for the right words. They wanted to talk, at the house. Not in the store, not in public, but in the privacy of home. I knew what it was about before they said a word. Maria. The kids. The car. The fact that she was living in my house, driving my car, and becoming a larger part of my life than anyone had expected. When we got to the house, all three were already sitting in the living room. The silence was heavier than any argument. Adam, ever the spokesperson, started asking questions. Why had I let Maria move in? Why was she driving my car? Why was I acting like this was all perfectly normal? His tone was sharp, almost accusing. He suggested Maria was taking advantage of me, using my loneliness and grief to manipulate her way into my life. Before I could respond, Emily cut him off. Her voice was firm, her eyes flashing with frustration. She defended Maria, insisting she wasn't manipulative, that she wasn't the kind of person Adam was painting her to be. Jessica, quiet until now, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, trembling. She asked if Maria and I had been intimate. I told her the truth. No. Not yet, at least. But Adam wasn't satisfied. He pressed further, asking if I was truly prepared to start over, raising 3 young kids who weren't even mine. It wasn't the question that stung. It was the implication behind it, that family only matters if it's bound by blood. That's when I made a decision. I stood up, left the room, and came back holding a stack of papers, the DNA test results. I handed them out, Adam's, Jessica's, Emily's, and told them the truth. I wasn't Adam or Jessica's biological father. For years, I had carried that secret, choosing to focus on what mattered, that they were my kids. I had been there for every scraped knee, heartbreak, graduation, and milestone. Jessica broke first, tears streaming down her face as she covered it with her hands. Emily sat frozen, silent tears running down her cheeks. Adam's voice, low and tight, broke the silence. I don't care what the test says. You're my father. You've always been my father. Looking at them, I felt something inside me shift, a weight I'd carried for so long finally lifting. I told them about Lisa. About her affair with David. About how I had discovered the truth and chosen to stay because I loved them too much to walk away. I explained how Lisa had confessed everything, begged for forgiveness, and how we had tried to rebuild after the lies came to light. And for the most part, we had succeeded. But those lies never fully disappeared. They lingered in the quiet spaces between us, fragile and unresolved. Jessica asked why I had taken the DNA test when Adam was in the hospital. If I'd had doubts all along. I told her the truth, I didn't. I went to that lab ready to give my son, a kidney, hoping and praying I'd be a match. But the results shattered something in me. Emily asked why I had shown them the results now, after all these years. I told her because Adam had asked if I could love kids who weren't biologically mine. And I needed him to know I already had. That love isn't about blood. It's about showing up, day after day, and choosing to stay, even when it's hard. The room fell silent. Jessica wiped her eyes, and Emily stared at her hands. Finally, Adam stood up, crossed the room, and hugged me, tight, as if letting go would make me disappear. Jessica followed, then Emily. In that moment, it felt like we were piecing ourselves back together, one hug, one tear, one breath at a time. When they pulled away, Emily said something that caught me off guard. She said Maria and her kids deserved that kind of love too. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the DNA results on the coffee table. It hit me how fragile everything really is, how one buried truth can unravel decades of love and trust. But it also hit me how strong love can be, how it holds things together even when the seams are fraying. I thought about Maria upstairs, probably tucking Sophie into bed, probably wondering if she and her kids really belonged here. And I realized something. This wasn't just about helping them anymore. It wasn't about being a good person or doing the right thing. I wanted them here. I wanted Maria here. But wanting something and making it work are two very different things. You ever look around during one of those perfect moments, those rare, fleeting times when everything feels right, and realize you're bracing for something to go wrong? That's how it felt that Christmas morning. The tree glowed softly in the corner of the living room, casting warm light over scattered wrapping paper and ribbons. The kids were tearing into their gifts, their faces lighting up with every discovery. Mike clutched his stuffed unicorn like it was a treasure, showing it proudly to Maria. Luke held 2 DVDs, Titanic and Shrek, grinning as he handed them over. Sophie walked carefully to her mother, clutching a small bottle of perfume. "Mommy, that was the last one, and I had just enough money," she said, her voice so serious it nearly made me laugh. Maria's eyes glistened as she unscrewed the cap and took a small sniff. She turned the bottle to see the price tag, $50. Our eyes met, and in that glance, there was gratitude, love, and something unspoken. The kids' stockings were filled with candy and small toys, but when I told them to check for one last surprise, their faces lit up. 3 bikes. Hidden in different corners of the house. Mike and Luke found theirs, no training wheels because they were big boys. Sophie's was bright pink, with training wheels firmly attached. The pure joy on their faces hit me harder than I expected, and I had to turn away to catch my breath. Maria watched it all with a soft smile, her arms folded like she was hugging herself. In that moment, she looked peaceful. But there was one more gift. A small, carefully wrapped box with Maria's name on it. When I handed it to her, her hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon. Inside was a deep red satin nightgown with delicate lace trimming. It was bold, maybe too bold, but undeniably beautiful. Her face flushed as she glanced at me before folding it back up. "I wasn't sure about the size," I said awkwardly. She smiled, a real, genuine smile, and whispered, "Thank you." But beneath the laughter and the gifts, there was tension. A question hanging between us: what happens now? As the day went on, the kids played with their toys, and Maria helped me clean up the mess. Our hands brushed a few times, our eyes met across the room. Each glance felt charged, like a live wire between us. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Maria and I sat on the couch in the warm glow of the Christmas lights. "You did all this, Mark," she said softly. "You gave my kids a Christmas they'll never forget." I told her I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because it felt right. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching mine. "Why are you doing this, Mark? Really? Why?" The question caught me off guard. I could have given her a dozen answers, that I cared about her kids, that I wanted to help, that I enjoyed having them here. But none of those answers would have been true enough. The truth was, I cared about her. I wanted her to stay. I wanted her kids to keep filling this house with noise and laughter. I wanted the ache in my chest, the one I'd been carrying since Lisa died, to finally fade away. But I couldn't say that. Not yet. So I said, "Because it feels right." She nodded slowly, lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might say more. But instead, she stood up and said goodnight. I stayed on the couch long after she'd gone upstairs, staring at the twinkling lights on the tree. The days that followed felt like a dream. We fell into a rhythm: school drop-offs, quiet dinners, late-night movies. Maria and I moved around each other like two people who had been doing this for years. But something was changing. Slowly, the space between us was shrinking. One evening, I found Maria in the kitchen after the kids had gone to bed. She was washing dishes, wearing one of my old sweatshirts, her hair pulled back loosely. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a moment before clearing my throat. She turned and smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mark, we can't keep pretending this isn't happening." I froze. She put down the dish and turned to face me, her hands clutching the counter's edge. "This, whatever this is between us, it's real. And it's getting harder to ignore." She was right. I took a step closer, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us was thick, charged with something heavy and undeniable. But before either of us could speak, a small voice cut through the silence. "Mommy." "Uncle Mark." Sophie stood in the doorway, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Maria let out a shaky breath and walked over, scooping her daughter into her arms and whispering softly to her. I stayed frozen as Maria carried Sophie back upstairs. When she returned a few minutes later, she paused in the doorway, her face unreadable. "Good night, Mark." She disappeared up the stairs, leaving me alone in the dim light of the kitchen. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Maria was right. Whatever was happening between us, it was real. And it wasn't going away. But love, real love, isn't simple. It's not clean or easy. With everything that had happened in both our lives, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something fragile. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything we'd built, everything we'd felt, could come crashing down. I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. But ready or not, the line between us had already been crossed. And there was no going back now. After Maria turned down my first proposal, I won't lie, I was disappointed. But her reasoning was solid. She wasn't saying no forever, just not yet. And honestly, I respected her more for it. She wanted us to build something real, something lasting. We settled into a peaceful routine. Maria became my partner in every sense, sharing responsibilities, finances, and quiet moments that made life feel fuller. Every Friday, she'd deposit $200 into our joint account, and every Sunday, we'd sit at the kitchen table and plan our expenses for the week. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. The kids became the heart of the house. Mike, always questioning and determined to be the man of the house. Luke, charming everyone with his grin. And Sophie, sweet little Sophie, who melted my heart with every hug and smile. But happiness always carries a shadow of doubt. Some nights, I'd catch Maria sitting by the window, staring into the dark yard. When I asked what was wrong, she'd just smile and say, "Nothing, Mark. Just thinking." But I knew better. She was scared of letting herself believe in something good, only to have it fall apart. I was scared too. But fear didn't stop us from living. The months leading up to Emily's wedding were a blur. Emily asked Maria to be her maid of honor, and Maria cried when she heard. She said she'd never had such a close friend before. The wedding day arrived in a flash. Maria buzzed around helping Emily with last-minute details while I kept the kids entertained. Mike and Luke looked sharp in their little suits, and Sophie was a vision in her tiny dress. Walking Emily down the aisle was harder than I expected. My little girl, all grown up, starting her own life. The reception was beautiful, laughter, dancing, and pure joy. At one point, Maria pulled me onto the dance floor. "Mark," she said softly, "I think this is the happiest I've ever been." I didn't say anything. I just held her tighter. But there was still something I needed to do. During the bouquet toss, the flowers landed right in Maria's hands. The room erupted in laughter, but Maria looked hesitant. Then came the garter toss. Emily's husband handed me the garter with a grin. "Sorry, gentlemen," he said. "This one's for my father-in-law." The crowd went quiet as Maria sat down in the chair. I knelt in front of her, slipped the garter up her leg, and paused. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a ring. "Maria," I said, "I've waited like you asked. But I know, without a doubt, that you're the woman I want by my side for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes, and her hands trembled as she held mine. And then, from the crowd, Sophie's little voice broke the silence. "Say yes, Mommy." Maria laughed through her tears and nodded. "Yes, Mark. Yes, I'll marry you." The room erupted into cheers. Emily hugged Maria tightly. Adam and Jessica clapped, and Mike and Luke jumped up and down. I slipped the ring onto her finger, kissed her, and felt something inside me settle, a deep, unshakable certainty. We married in a small ceremony a few months later, surrounded by family and close friends. Maria quit her job at Joe's Diner and started helping me at the store. Customers loved her, and pretty soon, people stopped by just to see her smile. We decided to take our time with adoption. I told Maria I wanted to, but she said we should wait until it felt right. Sophie had already started calling me Daddy, and the boys switched between Uncle Mark and Dad, depending on their moods. But titles didn't matter, what mattered was how we felt about each other. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, Maria and I sat on the couch watching Titanic. Luke had picked it out as a Christmas gift for his mom, and Maria insisted we watch it together. Sophie fell asleep halfway through, just as I'd predicted. As the credits rolled, Maria leaned her head on my shoulder. "Thank you, Mark. For everything." In that quiet moment, with the soft glow of the TV and the gentle sound of our kids sleeping upstairs, it hit me. Happiness isn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about quiet nights, shared laughter, and the promise that no matter what happens, you'll face it together. Maria and I didn't have a perfect love story. But it was ours. And that was more than enough.